British Columbia is world-renowned for its natural beauty, diverse communities, and thriving culture. It's also known for being in the grips of a housing affordability crisis decades in the making, which has been compounded by a poison drug crisis and by the COVID-19 pandemic. The province has an ambitious plan to address the crisis through the largest investment in housing affordability in BC's history. Tasked with building tens of thousands of homes in hundreds of communities is BC Housing, the province's agency responsible for developing, managing, and administering a wide range of subsidized housing and homelessness services across the province. BC Housing doesn't do this alone. To address the challenge, they're working with hundreds of partners. In this podcast, you'll get to hear from those delivering innovative and exciting affordable housing solutions. I'm Sarah from BC Housing, and this is Let's Talk Housing. Welcome to Let's Talk Housing. In this episode, we are going to discuss BC Housing's collaboration with First Nations and Indigenous communities around British Columbia to provide quality, appropriate homes. I'd like to acknowledge that we are recording this podcast on the ancestral homelands of hundreds of Indigenous peoples and nations across British Columbia, each with their own unique traditions and history. Today, I am on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have been the caretakers of these lands for thousands of years. We offer our respect to their peoples, past and present. Also, in full transparency, this episode was recorded in October 2021 and reflects the issues at that time. Joining us today is Rod Hill, Director of Indigenous Asset Management at BC Housing. He works closely with First Nations in British Columbia to build partnerships that promote knowledge exchange about housing and asset management. Also with us is Michael Sadler, Director of Indigenous Relations for BC Housing. Michael builds relationships with Indigenous communities, identifies housing needs, and works to meet those needs with BC Housing programs and services. Rounding out our panel is Councilor Mark Thomas from the Shuswap Indian Band. Mark is a member of the Secwepemc Nation. He sits on the council for Shuswap Band and holds the portfolios for housing, aquatics, fish, and forestry. Today, he is here to speak about Indigenous housing strategies and how they fit in with the agreement signed with BC Housing. Mark, before we start, I'd like to invite you to provide a traditional opening for our session today.
Guksham. Thank you, Sarah. White, quiet up. Rensquest, Mark Thomas, Shuswap Indian Band. Creator, we look at your world and praise you for the diversity around us. Thank you for the gift of relationships, our connection with the people, animals, and the land. Help us, Creator, to see the differences and diversities as strengths. Help us to listen, to understand, to meet each other with wonder and anticipation. Reveal to us your way of reconciliation and guide us into bright relationships with all living things. Lead us to understand how Indigenous people have been and continue to be profoundly harmed by settler people and their institutions. Lead settlers to repent when denying Indigenous people respect, dignity, and the fullness of life. Help us to listen compassionately, to speak humbly, and to act justly. Help us to seek the peace, justice, and reconciliation you desire amongst all of your children. Tuksham, all my relations.
Haichka, thank you for that, Mark. Michael, I'd like to start with you and to get you to really help set the context for our conversation today. Now, BC Housing has been around for 50 years, and that might sound like a long time to some folks, but of course, First Nations have been living on these lands for thousands and thousands of years longer. Can you help explain to our listeners how BC Housing approaches building relationships with First Nations and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And that's a really good question. It's a question that we've been answering now for a number of years. I've been with BC Housing for about 6 of those years, and in that time, my like you described, my position is to build relationships and partnerships, and then try to help identify what some of the housing needs are across the province and with our communities, both on and off reserve. And it's challenging work, and I think one of the main reasons it's so challenging is just because the needs are quite diverse, and there's a lot of need out there, especially in our communities. So, it's really about listening to the community, what their needs are, and then trying to identify a program that we have, or creating a program that isn't in existence to help better meet those needs. And I think that's one of the things that we've been quite strong at, is adapting our programs, our services, and listening. And you know, I've worked in other parts of government before where there wasn't enough listening, and it was mainly, this is our policy, this is our program, and you've got to deal with it, and you got to try and fit whatever need you have into that. And I'd like to think that BC Housing is approaching it kind of differently. And we'll hear from Rod and Mark more about how that is put into action. But I'd like to think that we're making a concerted effort on all levels of our organization to really listen and extract information, learn, and then try and adapt our programming to better meet those needs.
Thank you, Michael, for that context. And of course, Rod, I'd like to bring you in here because this is the work that you do every day, really, is listening and collaborating with our First Nations partners. For our listeners, BC Housing has 4 MOUs with 19 First Nations throughout the province to collaborate and develop best practices, specifically when it comes to housing management and maintenance. Can you tell us a little bit about that program, Rod, and how it works?
Yeah, the MOU structure is really unique. It's the first of its kind anywhere in Canada. And the idea behind it, as I understand it, Michael, you can probably correct it if I'm wrong, but the history behind our MOUs is that as we were rolling out the Indigenous Housing Fund, as you know, one of the first of its kind of a provincial program to offer First Nation housing, regardless where they wanted to place it. As that happened, we also were successful in getting funding for our benefit to support social housing. And that was a fund, $1.1 billion to support BC Housing's projects because they were in dire need of investment. And we were able to demonstrate to our provincial government the need to invest into our housing by having a really solid program of asset management. And we then learn from the communities, you know, it's great that you're offering us this Indigenous Housing Fund, but we see that you were able to successfully get government money by showing some needs here. Can you support us to do the same thing? So it was really Michael in collaboration with some of our leaders that brought this program to bear. And they brought me in 3 years ago just to make these agreements work and to move forward with them. And at the time, we really didn't have much of an understanding of what the issues and barriers were. We just wanted to make a difference. We wanted to find a way to improve the quality of lives of British Columbians. And this was seemed like a natural thing for us to do. Part of that stem out of that was that let's see what we can do about offering that technical expertise. So BC Housing, we have a fair amount of technical expertise, 50 years of operating 65,000 plus units across the province. And we could take that knowledge that we've built up through that time and with that scale to say, how can we support our First Nation partners with that? And there's some things that we've learned that we can do, but other things that may not fit, and we don't know what those are. So let's see if there's some willing people out there and we can work together. And Mark at Shuswap is a great example. They've been doing their housing and working with it for generations now, and they've learned a lot of how to navigate through the Indian Act and some of the challenges that federal housing programs have had in place with that. And we could offer the technical expertise, but we had a lot to learn. So we really said, yeah, let's have a partnership. Let's see what that looks like, and let's see what we can learn together, and see if this improves the condition of housing for the communities, and then see if we can learn some lessons to become a better partner in the future.
Thank you, Rod. That's a great introduction to the memorandums of understanding, the MOUs that BC Housing has with First Nations. And I'd like to bring you in here, Mark, because you're with one of the First Nations that's implementing these MOUs on the ground. Can you tell us a little bit about why this agreement is so important for you and your community?
Thank you. Yes, of course. Thanks for that introduction from everybody. I can only speak for Shuswap Band, but we are part of another group that Rod had referred to earlier is 4 other Chinooka bands. So although you introduced me from the nation, I only am representing my one band. Part of the issues that historically occurred was the fact that we were only able to be allotted Section 95 programs. And these Section 95 programs were very limited in scope. They didn't provide for very many floor plans. I think there was only 5 floor plans that were available at the time. Much of the construction at that time wasn't created for the climate or the conditions that they were put in. There was issues such as the coast, as you have saline, very wet conditions, and in the interior you have very dry conditions, and so just those 2 factors. And in the north you have cold conditions. So there's these 3 factors alone provide for differences in needs in housing, and based on that, those five plans, albeit were meant to be all encompassing, didn't meet the needs of everybody. And maybe they did in one area where they were created, but that was about it. So what we needed to do was to be able to understand what those conditions are that those houses are being built in, meet the needs of the people, whether it be cultural needs, whether it be climate needs or family needs. Another thing is that as the families grew, there was no opportunities to make sure that the houses were going to grow with the families. And so if you had a few kids born, what are you going to do? There was no programming available. So you would typically put an addition onto your home. Your addition was not up to code, mostly, for the most part, and provided for faulty wiring, things like that, which would typically end up as hazards. Some other issues that were going on there is that housing is not able to be made into equity for the Indigenous people. So once that equity is not being made as it is in the real world from everybody, they don't have access to, say, a second mortgage if they want to improve their home or improve their living conditions, or even just borrow money against their home. That home is currently held in trust by the federal government today, and continues to be. And so this continues to be a huge issue on how do we make it so that it's more, equitable for the person. It's more geared towards market-based homes. It meets the needs of the people. That's currently not there right now. And if we had the right programs in place at the beginning, we would probably not be needing this podcast right now, or the program that we're discussing today.
Such a good point there, Mark. And I really want to explore a couple of the themes there that you raised. First, I'm thinking, Michael, if you could maybe talk to us a little bit more and help our listeners understand the complexities around land title, right? So Mark mentioned Section 95. He mentioned the role of the federal government. And right now in British Columbia, the provincial government is investing in housing on reserve. Sounds like a great idea. Sounds simple in practice, but for people that don't have as much understanding of the complexities of title, can you talk a little bit about how BC Housing is working with nations to address that?
When we made the decision to open up our funding to go on reserve, that was a first of its kind in Canada, and it was the right thing to do again, because British Columbians are British Columbians for the most part. So, but there are differences when you go on reserve, such as Mark alluded to. It presents different issues, and the issues vary. For us to do the type of work that we do on our nation and the way that we typically fund projects now, there are some hurdles that we have to jump over that we're not used to jumping over. Maybe different hurdles off reserve, because there's always hurdles, and some of them are similar, but there are specific ones on nation. Like we create creating a mortgageable interest, and because, as Mark alluded to, we don't own our land; it's held in trust by the Crown. And so it's much different. We have to get, because banks, for example, who we get the loans from, they want to see how, if something were to happen, like a default, how they're going to get their money out of it. And if they don't own the land, well, then that takes that off the table. So we have to find different ways and means of doing that through different sort of instruments. And some of those instruments are like ministerial loan guarantees, or using land designation. If a First Nation has a land code already developed, that is much easier for us to work with, because then it's the First Nation that develops their policies around land utilization. If it's treaty, it's even more simple because it's like fee simple land. And so, adapting a large organization like ours that has been used to doing their business a certain way for, like we said, 50 years, it's not always the easiest thing to do, but I think we've done a fairly good job so far in addressing some of those issues for sure.
Rod, one thing I'd like for you to build on a bit from what Mark was talking about is just the complexity really from a maintenance perspective, right? So we're building housing, we're repairing housing in a diverse range of climates. When your team has been working with First Nations in those different parts of the province, what type of knowledge sharing is taking place right now, and how do you think that's informing the delivery of housing services?
Yeah, Sarah, that's a great question. And most of the reason why it's a great question is because the data just doesn't exist. If we look at where the data currently comes from, we're relying on census information that we don't know how accurate that is. Honestly, the realities of Indigenous responses to census data is not really robust in the best of times. But we're relying on that information really to understand where the needs are. So from that perspective, in Canada across the board, the number of homes is almost 1/3 of all homes in across Canada. If they're on reserve, then they're in need of major repairs and or are overcrowded. So that speaks to a reality of that there's some significant systemic barriers that are in place that make it tremendously difficult for Indigenous peoples to access a safe, affordable housing that meets needs. I think Mark pointed it out as well, but I'll reinforce it. Because the number of floor plans that were available that were really kind of not appropriate for the local ecosystem, there's some real challenges that we have in British Columbia. So when we're talking to our groups, we have the one agreement with Talaha and Shuswap in the Cranbrook area in the Kootenays. Really dry climate can get pretty hot in the summertime. We also have another one with some First Nations and communities in the Merritt area. Similar types of environment, almost desert-like. And those communities were at tremendous risk of forest fire this year. And then another community is in the north, at the Nisga'a Nation, which is a treaty First Nation. So really different context again, but right on the coast. And so they have some marine climate issues, and they have climate change concerns about rising sea level and storm frequencies and storm intensities. So it's really interesting to have the conversations with all of the First Nations because the needs are so diverse. It's incredibly diverse province with unique needs in each First Nation. The other one that Mark pointed on, but I think we can really elaborate on, is that housing is not core funded by Indigenous services, and what that leads to, specifically in British Columbia, as a unique item, is that many communities in British Columbia are small. The median size of First Nation in British Columbia is 200 people. And that's small in the Canadian context, but then that means that your housing portfolio is small. So the nations don't get the economies of scale that are available to hire maintenance staff and to hire housing managers. And so we have a variety of sizes of First Nations that we work with as well. So it's interesting to learn some of the challenges of the economies of scale. And some of the challenges related to the housing manager position is that because it's not core funded by Indigenous services, there's a large turnover in that position. So 50% don't make 5 years, and I think it's within 2 years, like 30% don't make it, 20 or 30%. But there's a large turnover and lots of positions where there's multiple responsibilities by the housing manager. And it's a tremendously challenging position because you're really at cross purposes with the community when there's dire need of housing, and the existing housing is usually in not great condition. So there's supporting the housing managers to be able to make decisions on a proactive basis, put plans in place. Those things are really important, and we're taking the steps towards that. I saw that you caught the news of our signing to become corporate partners with corporate members of the First Nation Housing Professional Association. So that's a new organization just started within the last few years. And they're attempting to put professional standards and training and programs in place for housing managers. And we see that as a tremendous opportunity to support the communities. From the things we've learned already, the importance of a good housing manager can't be understated.
So, Mark, Rod touched on some things here, and I'd like to bring you in and have you respond to some of them. Rod mentioned that 1/3 of the homes on reserve are in need of repairs or overcrowded, and really that's by design of our colonial system. So, Mark, can you tell us a little bit about how your band and including your housing manager is working to address these inequities right now in your community?
Yes, thank you. And I have to give a shout out to Dolores, our housing manager, who is fantastic, has done such an incredible job at my time and leadership. I couldn't have asked for anybody better. I will put out there that we have just completed the round of about 18 homes. Um, the first round of 16 was meant to be single or two-bedroom homes built to standards of super efficiency. So you could heat those with basically a baseboard heater, and you would be able to be nice and warm almost all year, which is totally different standards than typically our wood-burning stoves that we would use. Our, the windows, things like that weren't very well put in, or just weren't, up to the code or what was needed for the climate. Typically, they'd crack or dry out or something like that, and then next thing you know, you got drafts and bugs coming in, all kinds of stuff. That's what it led to. But we are now going on to another 5 homes that are family based. They're modular in essence. But I will say that all of the funding that we've gotten to date has been through either CMHC, another funding agency in the area, and like it's been in our own source funding. Basically, we've had to go out and target these funds. We were lucky just on the last go round. I mentioned the 5 family based homes. They will be fully funded by CMHC. This was some money that they had left over at the end of the year. But once again, those modular homes, albeit they are better construction that we typically would have had, they're still not designed to what the owner would like. And so they're still limited by floor plans, by things like that. It's not typical of somebody getting a home and saying, "Oh, this is going to be my home. I'm going to build. I'm going to, have my fireplace over there or whatever here." It's still set out for you. And so a lot of that is it's somewhat having the somebody telling you what to do all the time is not something that you're always fond of. And so that's how it still feels to some degree. And our housing manager is the one that goes out and targets all of those resources and seeks them down, chases them down, and makes these agreements with the different funders. And we sign off as leadership to them. And so a lot of the dedication, I guess the commitment and the hard work, the footwork, is done by her. And we appreciate that. And if you don't have somebody in-house that can do that, doesn't know the system, doesn't know who to talk to, isn't well voiced, you're going to have limitations. And those limitations are going to be in the sense that some people won't have anywhere to live. And so those are huge setbacks, and that's a lot of pressure to put on one person. And so to have a skilled person in that place is immeasurable. You need that person to have that knowledge, to have the contacts, to know a little bit about housing itself and construction, about electricity, about plumbing, a little bit of everything. But if you don't have that, you're going to be setting yourself up for failure, or you're just going to be spending a lot of time trying to get that person up to speed so that they can understand what needs to be done. And so I put a lot of emphasis on making sure that person meets your job description, and make sure your job description is well versed.
Some really good tips and pointers there, Mark. Michael, I'd like to come to you just to wrap things up here for us. We've covered a lot of different really complex topics today. When you take a look ahead at what's coming, what do you think that BC Housing's priorities need to be for Indigenous and First Nations housing in British Columbia?
The way that we're doing our business now is that we're going to listen, and we're going to create those relationships, and then we're going to let the Indigenous community set those priorities for us, because we really are dealing with a system that was set up for failure from the beginning. And that system was really based on funding housing through our income assistance program, as opposed to off reserve, where housing is a wealth building program. completely opposite ends of the spectrum. And so, you add to that, there weren't programs for maintaining homes. It was mainly just, here's the money and build the house and hopefully you build a good one and good luck. And we're starting to see the lasting effects of that kind of program now. And it's hitting us right here, right now. And the work that Rod's doing, the work that we're doing in terms of putting up new housing on reserve is trying to address that. And I think that, there's going to be a lot more learning that takes place. But I'm excited as a BC Housing employee. I'm sure Rod is too, to try and make that difference, because as we know, housing is a critical need all across our country and in particular on our First Nations. And we want to be part of that solution and part of that change. And I think we're on the right track to be able to do that.
Thank you for that. We have just had a really wonderful conversation here today. I know I've learned a lot. I'd like to thank Councilor Mark Thomas, Rod Hill, and Michael Sadler for joining us on Let's Talk Housing. Let's talk again soon. To learn how to apply for subsidized housing in British Columbia, visit our website, bchousing.org. You can also call us at 1-800-257-7756. That's 1-800-257-7756.